On behalf of the World Affairs Council, I'm Linda Calhoun, your moderator for this evening, and it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's guest. Nazila Fathi is a journalist, translator, and commentator on Iran who reported out of the country for nearly 2 decades until 2009, when threats from the Iranian government forced her into exile. She served as the only full-time New York Times correspondent in Iran for 8 years, and has also reported for Time magazine and Agence France Presse. Nazila has been an associate at Harvard's Belford Center at the Kennedy School of Government and has held fellowships at the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy and the Nyman Foundation. Please join me in welcoming Nazila Fathi for a conversation about the evolution of Iranian politics and society and her own experience living and working in Tehran. I got it all out. Thank you so much for joining us, Nazila. I would like to start our conversation at the beginning, and in my perspective, the 1979 revolution. And you're a young child, and I'd like to get your take on the impact of the revolution on you as a child and your family.
Well, first of all, thank you, Linda, for your kind introduction. It's such a pleasure to be here. I was 9 years old at the time of the revolution, so I don't remember the details of the things that were happening on the ground. For the book, of course, I went and I researched and I wrote about it. But I mean, my parents were not politically active, so I wasn't involved in what was happening. But one of the first things that I felt as a girl was that very quickly after the revolution, we had to cover ourselves. I was a young girl who went to a private school. I dressed any way that I wanted. I had never thought that somebody would tell me that you can't dress this way, you can't wear your jeans and t-shirt anymore. And then suddenly I had to go to school wearing a headscarf, a long, quite ugly, loose coat that was not comfortable. The material was nylon and quite scratchy, quite ugly pants underneath it. Nothing that was pleasant for a 9-year-old girl. And my mother, she tried to make the best out of it. I mean, she promised me that this would be the only year that I would wear it. Unfortunately, that never happened. Every year she promised, wear it, it's okay, the mullahs are gonna go and you will be free. That never happened. But the other thing that was also very close to my heart was that we lived in a housing complex. About 400 families lived together, and there was a swimming pool. And this swimming pool was the center of life for all of us kids, including the girls. I had swum my entire life until that age in that pool. And then suddenly we were banned from swimming in that pool because the Islamists decided that even young girls my age, they couldn't appear in public in their swimsuits. So me and my other friends, other girls my age or even older, we had to sit around the pool in our headscarves, those uncomfy clothes, and watch the boys swim in the pool. And of course, I mean, they couldn't swim forever either. They could swim only until the age of 15 or 16. And these were little things, but they began shaping us.
And now I want to move to talk about the revolution itself from a broader perspective. So the Shah was overthrown in 1979 and Khomeini took power. And at that time, many revolutionaries hoped for a democratic government. Can you tell us how Khomeini was able to so quickly impose such a restrictive and theocratic regime?
You're absolutely right. I remember many of my parents' friends had supported the revolution, but they were not Islamists. They were leftists. They were communists. I mean, those days, communism was the ideology of the avant-garde, and most upper-class, middle-class people, or even a lot of lower-class people who had gone to university, they'd become interested in communism. But Khomeini appeared as this very charismatic leader who mobilized the masses. He brought all the people into the streets and managed to bring about that great change, forcing the Shah to leave the country. But within days after his arrival, I remember very well picking up the daily newspaper. I always came home around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and it was my job to pick up the afternoon paper from our mailbox. And there was pictures of people. It was just like 2-3 days after Khomeini had returned to the country. They had executed 3 or 4 of the Shah's generals, people very close to him. And the bloodshed continued. And it was hard for people who had supported the revolution in hope of a democracy to support this kind of violence. So many of them were quite disillusioned very early on. Within weeks after the victory of the revolution, they stopped supporting Khomeini. But he was quite shrewd. He very early on, about a week, within the first week after his arrival, he set up 2 forces to protect his new regime. One of them was the Revolutionary Guards, which exists to this day. And the other one, they called it comité. They borrowed the word from French word comité, committee. And they were supposed to replace the local police. The comité was supposed to replace the local police, and the Revolutionary Guards was supposed to replace the army. They couldn't do it because the war broke out, and the army had to get involved in the war. The Revolutionary Guards also had to fight the war. So they kept the 2 forces there. But these 2 groups were very much involved in rounding up whoever opposed Khomeini. And very soon they went after the leftists, seculars, religious peoples who didn't support Khomeini's notions specifically. And he managed to solidify the foundation of the regime. And then the war broke out. The war was a blessing for him, because then he justified everything under the guise that we need to fight a foreign enemy. So he galvanized the entire country behind fighting the war, and any kind of violence at home was justified under the guise that we're fighting a bigger enemy. So
the war to Iraq. Right?
The Iraq, yes. Saddam attacked Iran in 1980. And the war dragged on for 8 years. Great opportunity for Khomeini to go after his opponents, calling them traitors, and get rid of them.
And who were the big winners? We know he came up with these 2 sort of forces to impose power, but who shared in the rewards or the spoils with Khomeini in power?
Definitely people who supported him and stayed with him. But I also believe a very big population, especially the ones that Khomeini referred to as mustazafin, the deprived, the lower classes, religious and traditional people who had chosen Khomeini as their leader, as their religious leader and political leader. They supported him, and they thought it was their duty to fight for him and to follow his orders, which was purging whoever opposed Khomeini. And because the new regime could not rely on the middle class, the upper class, the more educated people, very quickly it started marginalizing them, sidelining them, especially women. Many women who held senior positions were sidelined. They were fired. And replaced them with people from the lower classes, people who would have traditionally stayed in their villages. The women would have worked on the farm or made carpets. Khomeini encouraged them to come into society. A lot of them were hired by the government. They become civil servants. They had access to steady incomes, which improved their lives. And a very big population was withdrawn from margins of society, brought into the center of society, and gradually joined middle class.
And just to set the stage a little, someone from the audience was talking about the war that you're referring to was with Iraq. And just give us sort of an overview of why the Shah had to go. I mean, what sort of created the conditions for the revolution from your perspective?
Well, I think that's the question that only he could answer. Because I have always wondered, why did he leave? Why didn't he stay and just give in to different opposition groups and let them take part, take responsibility? There was no need for a revolution. There was no need for such violence and bloodshed. Of course, there was huge opposition against the Shah. A lot of people wanted things changed politically. A lot of activists wanted more political freedom. Human rights situation was horrible under the Shah. But then, quite unexpectedly, he left the country. I mean, many books have been written about it. Some people have argued that he was too ill. The medication that he was taking had weakened his will to stay, and it was just easier for him to leave the country. So I don't know what is the answer. I mean, definitely opposition against him had avalanched into a much bigger thing that it had been during the previous years. But I think he could have stayed, and things could have been different if he had allowed different political groups, communists, other leftist groups, religious groups, including Khomeini's party, and also seculars to take part in the government and had initiated the kind of democracy that people wanted. All we know is that he left. And without him, there was an institutional breakdown, huge insecurity. And of course, Khomeini, who had the mosques around the country, had great network around the country, had mobilized the masses behind himself, managed to hijack the revolution.
And now I want to talk more about the role of technology. Many repressive regimes try to control their citizens by limiting access to information, and it's become more difficult with the internet and social media. But regimes from China to Iran still try to impose censorship. How did this manifest itself in Iran?
After the advent of technology in Iran, there was no censorship very early on. Okay. I remember in the mid-1990s when the internet first came to Iran, there was absolutely no censorship. People could access any website that they wanted. Yahoo chat rooms were dominated by Iranians from every city. I did a story about that. You had to just name a city, and Iranians had named the chat rooms after their city or what they were doing. Persian poets, Tabrizi poets from different cities. And they were using it as a platform to connect, talk about everything, even taboo subjects such as sex. Nobody was embarrassed. Nobody was scared. There's no censorship in place. I think gradually as people started using the internet as a platform to express political opinions and use it for activism, the regime was alarmed and started introducing censorships. And it was in early 2000 that the first systematic censorship on the internet was enforced.
So now I'm going to turn the focus back to you personally. Nazila, you're a journalist, and what inspired you to become a journalist? Sometimes reporting despite seeing your colleagues arrested and sometimes killed.
When I started journalism and I sort of developed passion to become a journalist, at that time, Iranians who worked for foreign media, there was a very limited number of them. There weren't so many of them. And I hadn't come across anyone who had been threatened seriously or killed or jailed seriously. There was one British reporter who had actually become a businessman and was arrested, Roger Cooper, who has an amazing memoir. It's been forgotten. He was jailed for 8 years, but when he was arrested, he was a businessman. He was not a journalist anymore. So when I started my work, I was very well aware of the dangers. The government could easily charge you of being a spy. But I had grown up in Iran, defying a lot of bans. I wasn't an exception. A lot of Iranians live like that. I mean, all my friends live like that. They told us to wear the headscarf. We hated it, so we always found ways to show as much hair as we could. You were banned from hanging out with young men, with boys your age in public. We always hanged out. I mean, nobody gave in to the Islamic Republic's rules. We never submitted to all the things that the regime expected from people. So I wasn't intimidated by those things. I think I was really passionate to be able to report and tell our stories, tell the stories of Iranian people to an outside audience.
Now, it's interesting you're touching upon the defiance. I enjoyed reading about how initially you, even though there was the ban on Western media, you were still able to get movies and that sort of thing. Talk about your connection.
It became a way of life in the Islamic Republic to find ways to live with the things that people had lived before the revolution. When the Islamists came to power, they banned Western movies, even a lot of Iranian-made movies, because they were about subjects they didn't approve of. They didn't approve of subjects about love, family. The only movies that they broadcast on national TV, and we had only 2 channels then, were movies about the war. I mean, I've seen a lot of movies about World War II, ironically, even though President Ahmadinejad said that the Holocaust never happened, but the Islamic Republic had shown many of them to Iranian people. But, I mean, those were not the kind of movies that we wanted to see because, I mean, we were living in a war and we wanted to escape the realities around ourselves. We wanted to watch fun movies. We wanted to see movies that allowed us to get away from the Islamic Republic for even 2 hours. So this new job appeared. There were these young men who came to your home with a briefcase. And inside the briefcase, they usually carried a bunch of Betamax tapes those days. And in the early days, we used to get a lot of Indian movies. But gradually, they started getting us everything. The way they pirated movies those days, somebody would go in a movie theater with a handycam. They wouldn't even install the handycam on a tripod. And we could see people with their popcorn coming and going, sometimes laughing or booing. So we ended up watching movies that were being shown here at the same time at movie theaters.
So interesting ways around that. And then looking at 2009, unlike the 1979 revolution that overthrew the Shah, the 2009 Green Movement didn't seek to overthrow the regime. They were only demanding new elections. Why were these 2 uprisings so different in both their demands and outcomes? And I want you to talk a little bit about literacy, too, and if you think that had a role.
Well, I think no one can deny that Iranian society in general has changed very profoundly in the past 35 years since the revolution. A lot of people, because of government's policies, moved to the cities. About 70% of the population lives in urban areas and did in 2009. Education levels are extremely high. I mean, a lot of those women that the Islamic regime encouraged to come to the cities and work for the government, they went to university. They became very educated. Since 2000, more than half of university students have been women. By 2009, 62% of university students were women. And, that means there are more educated women in Iran than men. And you want to change a society, change their women, because they raise the next generation. 2009 was a very feminine movement. If you were on the ground, you could tell. There was no way you could deny it. I was talking to one of the activists who has recently moved to the States. He was very active in 2009, was one of the leaders. He was telling me that at one stage, he and a few other young men got very scared because government forces were right behind them. And they began running. They wanted to run away. And they thought government forces were behind them, so they were not even turning around to look back. They imagined them with just even aiming at them. They were that scared. And he said, then suddenly we saw a big number of women creating a chain in front of us, holding their hands together to stop us from running away. And he said that he was amazed that there was no fear in these women's eyes. And these women were out there from the first day, and they continued coming out. There were many, many photos captured of women who were throwing rocks, and also a lot of women, older women, who were throwing themselves between young men and government forces who were beating up these young men. They wanted to stop the fight. They wanted to stop the violence and somehow protect these young men. And there were a lot of women that towards the end of the demonstrations, they were writing very openly and calling on people to withdraw from the streets. They were arguing that they couldn't bring change by getting killed on the streets.
And Nazila, you put yourself in peril, really, to tell those stories, particularly when you were working for the New York Times. Can you give us sort of your career path and how you got to be in that position to witness the history and the stories that you were writing about?
Well, I started working with foreign reporters, including New York Times reporters, in 1992. I started out first as a translator, and then I fell in love with journalism. I decided that I'll do anything to become a journalist. And I got my first email very early on. Internet came to Iran very early on. The Islamic Republic liked the internet because it was a way for the regime to expand its reach in the cyberspace. They started translating Shiite books into Arabic, into English, and they put them on the internet. So it was something that they brought to the country and encouraged people to use. So when I got my first email, I started sending memos to reporters I had worked with, helping them to write stories because they couldn't come to Iran regularly. It was hard for them to get visa. As I started sending memos to reporters, they started looking at me as an asset. They put me on a retainer, and so I became a journalist finally. And there were other protests that I covered. I don't think 2009 was something that suddenly appeared out of nowhere. It was part of a movement that grew and emerged in the shape that it appeared in 2009. The first major anti-regime protests broke out in 1999. They were huge. For a week, protests were rocking the country everywhere. Small towns, villages, and the regime was quite terrified about those. But 2009 was clearly the largest in terms of scale. In terms of, I think what was amazing was the maturity that people displayed during these protests. And I think it was clearly the result of the fact that Iranian society has changed. People were chanting that they wanted new elections. Nobody was talking about overthrowing the regime. The anger avalanched as the government used force against people. People were killed. People were very angry, but they were very aware that there's no alternative to Islamic Republic. There's no other option. So, this was the biggest story of my life. The government banned us from covering the protest. I think about a day or 2 days after the election, I received a letter by fax that said I was not allowed to go out on the streets and cover the protest if anything happened to me. The Ministry of Culture, which was the body that somehow provided us with some kind of security. If we got into trouble, somebody from the ministry would call and get us out. They said that they wouldn't take any responsibility if we left our offices or home offices. But I covered it. Many others did. It was just the biggest story that has happened in this country.
And there was considerable pushback. I mean, you were under surveillance, both inside your home and outside your home. Talk about that.
I don't think I was under surveillance at my home at that stage anymore. I had managed to liberate myself from the surveillance inside my home. But yes, a couple of days, no, more than that, about 2 weeks after the protest had broken out, I received a call from a commander I had met during one of the protests. He had been in charge of a crackdown against the protesters. He was trying to be sympathetic. He said, stop going out. They've given your photo to snipers, and if they've been ordered to shoot you if they see you on the streets. But it was a very emotional time. People were coming out in great numbers. My neighbors, whom I never thought were political, I would see them from my living room window every day around 3 o'clock coming out, marching toward the main street to go and join the protesters. There was an amazing energy in the air that just drew you. It was not like a time that you wanted to be brave. I mean, nobody thought about that. There was a very strong sense of solidarity in the air that just encouraged you to go out. So I kept going out until one of my colleagues was arrested, and then a day after that, I noticed there were about 16 men outside my home. That terrified me.
And so I know that at that time you had a trip to Toronto already planned, and you were going with your husband, and you have 2 children at this point, a son and a daughter. And so when you left, you weren't really, were you thinking that you would be gone forever in exile at that trip?
No, and I keep on wondering, how come I didn't see it that way? But I had planned this trip for months before, but when the protest broke out, I thought, I'm not going to go, I'm going to stay. This is a big story. But then after the surveillance team appeared outside our home, we thought we were going to use the tickets and leave. But I thought things are going to go back to normal within a couple of weeks. We had return tickets, which of course we never used. But it never occurred to me that this was it. There had been other times that I'd come under pressure. My house had even come under surveillance. But I mean, the way the kind of people who had come outside our home, the way they were watching us was very different than this time. But I had laid low for a while, and then things would have been okay. But this time, it didn't.
And what was the exact moment that you knew you were now living in exile?
It was a few months after we had left the country. We kept on postponing our return. And then gradually a couple of people who had been arrested, they were released. And the first thing they did, they started calling people that they thought were in danger. I received calls from several people who warned that my name had come up repeatedly during their interrogations. My colleague who had been arrested, he was with Newsweek, the subject of the movie Rosewater. He said that the way his interrogators had portrayed the entire scenario was that we Iranians who worked for foreign media, a couple of us were behind the protest that we had plotted the entire thing. So I think the government was looking for a way to justify what had happened, and we were the perfect scapegoats.
Mm-hmm. And tell us a little bit about what your life has been like since you've been in exile, since 2009.
We lived in Toronto for a year, and I continued to cover Iran for the New York Times from Toronto.
So they weren't able to silence you?
No, they weren't able to. And actually it became easier because people were willing to talk to me when I was in Toronto, but when I was in Tehran during the last weeks, nobody wanted to speak to me. They thought my phone was tapped, and it was dangerous to talk to me. So I covered the protests and whatever came next for about a year. Then I went to Harvard. I was very lucky to win a Nieman Fellowship. And we started thinking that this is it. We're not going back. And our kids started going to school. Very quickly, they started speaking English. And they started growing roots. They liked their life. But in the meantime, it was very clear to us that they felt lost. No matter how old people are, but when you land in exile, there's a sense of loss. It's like you grow roots where you live. And if you immigrate, you think about it, you plan it. We hadn't done that. We hadn't gone through that initial stage of planning and preparing ourselves psychologically to live in a new place. So it was tough. It was really tough for us. And they say that when you are in a place, you start getting used to the environment around you. You start growing roots. But for us, that took a long time because we were not ready to start that life.
So you're still following what's going on in Iran very closely and reporting on it. A question I wanted to ask you has to deal with Hassan Rouhani, who was hailed as a moderate leader that would change the direction of Iranian policy. What was your reaction to his election in 2013, and has your view of him changed since then?
Well, Hassan Rouhani was the most moderate candidate out of 10 candidates that the government had screened and allowed to run. He was not the ideal candidate. He was the best that people could pick, and they voted for him. But I remember, a lot of Iranians remember that in 1999, he came and spoke against the protesters, the student protesters. He said a couple of them had to be executed so that they would become examples for the rest of the people. But what was interesting that in 2013, during the presidential election, he constantly talked about more freedom, political freedom and social freedom, the rights of dissidents, free press, things that Iranian society longed for. And 10 years earlier, they were not things that politicians usually discussed. And it wasn't just him. It was even radical candidates who talked about these things. The fact is that Iranian leaders, whether it's Hassan Rouhani or even Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, they are very well aware of the kinds of demands that Iranian people have. They know that the majority of the population is young, and they really want more social and political freedom. But how much can they deliver? That's the big question. Rouhani talked about it. He had clearly come a long way from his positions in 1999. But, and there has been relatively a more free space in Iran. But the kind of change that Iranians want is a lot more than what they are being offered now. As we were talking about it earlier, grassroots change has come to Iran. On a social level, Iran has changed from bottom up, but the kind of change that this society expects, the kind of change that has to come from top to bottom, it hasn't come. And Iranian leaders are very resistant to give that kind of leeway. I mean, it looks like they're afraid that if they give in, they're afraid that they're going to lose their grip on power.
Mm-hmm. And we've received quite a few questions from our audience, which I'd like to bring into our conversation. And so let's start with this one. What should or could be Iran's position on the world stage? Where do you think it can be, the role it can play?
Well, Iran is not going to go anywhere. And the Islamic Republic is not going to go anywhere, at least for the time being. It's been there for 35 years. And it's going to be there. And in the Middle East, Iran is an island of stability because of what's happening in the region. And it is surrounded by countries that are not in a desirable shape. Iraq, Syria is not that far from Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan. And the instability is spreading. And Iran has influence in a lot of these countries. Starting with Hezbollah, moving down to Iraq, in Syria, or even in Yemen over the Houthis. So Iran can play a stabilizing a role in the region. Of course, Iran is a divided country. It's divided between hardliners and the more moderate figures. And the hardliners have used these arms in the region for destabilizing reasons. A lot of people who are hoping that the nuclear talks would succeed and sanctions would be lifted on Iran are hoping that that would help moderates to have the louder voice in the country, that it would empower them. And by empowering them, the outside world, the West, would be encouraging Iranian moderates to craft policies that are more responsive to international demands.
And you raise an issue that we have quite a few questions about, talking about, and that's Iran's nuclear ambitions or lack thereof. One question here asks, how do you think lower oil prices are impacting Iran and their position at the negotiating table to come up with a nuclear agreement?
Lower oil prices, I think, have had a much more profound effect on Iran's economy than the sanctions, because Iran has been under some kind of sanctions for the past 35 years, and the regime has become expert at circumventing these restrictions. But falling oil prices has completely different consequences for the country. But let's not forget that Iran survived when oil was under $10 a barrel. For a long time, I remember a time that it was $7 a barrel. It is definitely pressuring the government, but it is not putting the kind of pressure that some people might think. It would not put Iran's economy at the verge of a collapse, definitely. I think Iran is looking for a good deal now. It's not going to agree to any kind of deal because oil prices are falling and the economy is under the pressure of sanctions. Because every time Iranians have left the negotiation table and they've come back 2 years later, they've been offered a better deal. And in the past couple of years, they have made huge progress in the nuclear program. The program has not suffered. The economy has, but the program hasn't. So I hope that both sides, both the Iranians and the Western negotiators, are being reasonable about what's doable and what are Iran's expectations from a deal.
And from your perspective, what do you see as the end result for Iran and its nuclear ambitions? Is it enriching uranium for these peaceful energy purposes, or do you think the ultimate aim is to have nuclear arms?
There's no evidence that Iran has built the weapon. A lot of people assume that Iran wanted to have capability, and it has capability now. So perhaps this is the right time to reach an agreement. However, I think in return for this, and they have complied with all their obligations since last year, since last November in 2013. They've been getting rid of their enriched uranium. I think in return for that, they want the sanctions to be lifted. They don't want temporary relief. I think they are looking for some kind of permanent agreement that would eventually lead to development of Iran's economy.
Now, this question is asking about the Washington Post reporter Jason Rezaian, I guess, who has been detained by Iran, and what happened to the foreign minister who defended him with Kerry. And then they were also asking about the Pharrell's video, Happy, and, you know, the people who were arrested for dancing in that video. So two-part question for you.
Well, unfortunately, that was a very bad answer that Iran's foreign minister gave. He was asked about Jason Rezaian, the Washington Post reporter who has been jailed in Iran for over 6 months now. And Ahmadinejad used to say that the judiciary is separate from his branch of power. And he's sorry about what has happened, or sometimes he would say, we can't do anything, as simple as that. But the foreign minister unfortunately came out and said that Jason Rezaian is an Iranian citizen as well, and Iran would deal with him according to the way it deals with an Iranian citizen. And he said that he didn't feel obligated to explain why he had been arrested. So it was very disappointing. I think for reporters, for me, because Jason was my colleague, I think that was a very inappropriate response. But his arrest, what happened to people who were involved in making the video about Happy, and also many other things. The number of executions have dramatically increased since Rouhani's election. They are all signs that hardliners are using the leverage that they control to embarrass this government, to put pressure on the government, and to undermine the kind of works that he's doing. And one of them is to embarrass him in the international community so that the government's efforts regarding the nuclear dossier would fail.
And then the other part of that question was the controversy over the song Happy was a phenomenon around the world, and people lip syncing and doing videos to that, and the young people that were arrested in Iran, but ultimately defended. I mean, what was your sense of that episode and how it was handled?
It's strange. I mean, they go after 5 or 6 people who make a video of themselves in the privacy of their home. And then a few weeks after that, in November, a pop musician passed away. He was young, he had cancer. And then immediately people send out a message on Viber everywhere, all around the country. Hundreds of thousands of people poured out on the streets, singing and dancing the musician's songs, including women. And you know, singing in public is banned. Women are not allowed to sing. Coming out in such great numbers are banned. So, and the government ends up broadcasting the images on TV to show that they also supported the musician who passed away. So from one side, they are trying to repress those they can get their hands on for making a video of themselves just dancing. From the other side, they are aware that the desires go beyond these people. It goes deep into society. A lot of people want to be allowed to do whatever they want to do. Being happy is a right, and they want to be able to express their happiness on the streets of their country, in public. And they have, in the past 15 years, 20 years, Iranian people have shown the government that they have the ability to reclaim public spaces to express their joy and happiness, even when there's a funeral involved.
Yeah. And one of the things that you wrote about that was very interesting, and I think feeds into this, is the fact that everywhere you go, you say in Iran, there's a satellite dish. So, I mean, people have access to all the imagery and, you know, obviously its impact in terms of what the government can and can't say to them. But do you want to talk about that a little more?
Yeah, I think satellite TV was one of the most important connecting technologies that came to Iran. Because, for example, the internet was something that younger people used, but after the revolution, the Islamic regime encouraged people to have TVs, and the number of TV ownership increased dramatically. The numbers were very low before the revolution because a lot of people were poor or they didn't have electricity in their villages. The revolutionaries expanded the grid, the electric grid, and encouraged people to buy TV because through TV, the revolutionaries wanted to send their message to their supporters everywhere around the country. And then when satellite TV came, these families, these people were ready. I remember traveling to one of the farthest places in the country. There's a place called Zabul at the corner where Iran, Pakistan, and Afghanistan share a border. And there was nothing modern in the city. The houses were all mud houses. The only modern thing that you could see were satellite dishes over these mud houses. And when you watch the programs, they had these call-in programs, and people used to call and say that they were calling from this village, from this remote town. What satellite TV did was interesting because it kept on broadcasting what was appearing in independent publications or on websites, and was practically amplifying the message that Iranians inside the country were producing themselves. And so it became easy for people to hear the same message, the message that they trusted, because the Iranians have lost their confidence in state TV. They look at the state TV as the propaganda arm of the regime. They prefer to get their news from other sources of news, and there are various ones. I mean, the options are a lot now. There are Persian language Voice of America programs or Persian language BBC, and many opposition channels that are broadcast from Los Angeles, different parts of the world. So these programs have a very deep reach in the country.
So, you know, Nazila, you're talking about the impact in terms of media. We know that in the Green Revolution, women were a very strong, sort of fearless component, in that you've got increased literacy, you've got all of these pressures sort of building within our Iranian society. How do you see, what's your thought of a blueprint for how there will be greater freedoms in the future?
Well, that's the $1,000,000 question.
Thought I'd ask.
Everything is prepared this was a society that was not ready for a lot of things 40 years ago. A lot of families didn't want to send their daughters from the village to the city. They didn't want to let them go to university. They didn't think it was appropriate for a girl to go to university. That has already happened. And people are yearning for very simple freedoms. And the regime is quite resistant. But Iranians have been sending messages to the regime. I mean, 2009, I think the most important achievement of the protest was that people sent a very loud and clear message to the regime about what they want and what they don't want. And this is a regime that doesn't necessarily respond to these messages, but it clearly hears them and it understands them. And I think allowing Rouhani to become the president in 2013, because the regime could easily rig the vote again, ignore people's votes, and come up with its own ideal candidate. I think counting the votes was a sign that the regime realized that while international pressure has increased on the regime, it cannot survive without any kind of support inside the country. So it gave in.
And someone asked a question wondering how the feminist movement in the United States is having an impact in Iran, but I would also broaden that to be, you know, these democratic movements in the Middle East. How are they also impacting what's going on in terms of Iranian society now, in your opinion?
The feminism movement in Iran is very indigenous, especially when it was surfaced in the 1990s. It was mostly the Islamist women who launched the movement, publicly launched it, because secular women who were feminists, they were already denounced and already sidelined, and they were seen as agents of the West. But when religious women went to university, they became educated, they became empowered, and they started feeling the discriminations against themselves. And there were a lot of things that they were not happy about. I mean, their husbands were fighting in the war. If they were killed, they couldn't keep their children. The custody of the children belonged to the paternal father. So grandfathers would come and take the children away. So they were losing their husbands, they were losing their children. If the husbands were coming back alive, they had the right to marry a second wife, third wife. And they could divorce their wives anytime they wish. I mean, this is a famous article in the family law, 1133. A man can divorce his wife whenever he wishes. Exact same words.
Wow.
And he gets the custody of children. A woman, if he wants to file for divorce, he has to fight for it. It's not easy. So these women had felt the discrimination of the Islamic law that was introduced into the legal system after the revolution. And these women started calling themselves religious women who wanted equal rights with men. In those days, you couldn't call them feminists. They would get purple and get angry and say, no, we are Muslim women. There is nothing against women having equal rights with men in Islam. And they went to religious clerics in the city of Qom, where most of them live. They knocked on their doors and started asking them to interpret the laws according to the needs of time. Said society has changed and women are entitled to more rights. And gradually, they started calling themselves feminists as well. But the most important thing was that the gap between secular women and religious women disappeared, and they started working together to get more rights for women. When it comes to the movement, I think Iran's movement is very much a civil movement. It's not a political movement. Okay. And I don't call it a green movement or whatever, because it has appeared under different names. But the demands of this movement has remained the same. I mean, they all want more dignity. They want respect for citizens. I mean, this is a regime that has survived on intimidating its citizens, telling them what they can wear, what they can eat, what they can do, and what they cannot do. And it's frustrating. People are just fed up with that. I'm not sure how much it's been using any model outside the country.
Okay.
But I think Iranians consider themselves much more ahead of what has happened in the region. When Mubarak fell, I thought Iranians would be very envious, because Egyptians managed to get rid of Mubarak within weeks. And Iranians had staged protests for 6 months, and they couldn't get anything. I mean, they couldn't even force the regime to hold new elections. I went and started reading some of the stuff that leaders were writing, and they were very respectful. They congratulated the Egyptians. But they said, we were there 35 years ago. Democracy doesn't come easy. It's a process. And I think because of all the changes that has changed Iranian society, Iranians are really reluctant to go through another stage of institutional breakdown, collapse of the regime, because they are afraid that at times like that, radicals, a leader like Khomeini, can hijack the situation again.
And then speaking of, sort of forces that want to hang on to the status quo, I mean, you have one question here that was talking about, with the Revolutionary Guard, they have been the enforcers for 2 decades now and have entrenched economic interests. I mean, how can you talk about what those interests are, and then, the sort of problem that they're going to present as Iran makes this transition that seems inevitable?
The Revolutionary Guards were founded by Khomeini, and their job was to protect the Islamic regime, because Khomeini didn't trust the army. The army had turned its back against the Shah and had sided with the people. So the Islamic regime created its own force, and alongside that, it created a militia force that is controlled by the Revolutionary Guards. They call them the Basij. It's made up of volunteer forces. And these people who join them, they are rewarded very generously with jobs, salaries, bonuses, and of course it helps them move up in society. But I think the biggest difference between members of Revolutionary Guards before the death of Khomeini, and since his successor Khamenei has taken power, is that when Khomeini was alive, a lot of these people were driven ideologically. There were a lot of senior clerics involved, and a lot of these people, they considered the establishment as a religious one, and these members were driven by ideology. But after Khamenei took power, he was a mid-ranking cleric, and he was promoted to the position of an Ayatollah because his rank needed to justify his position. Khomeini was very afraid that he couldn't earn the respect of senior clerics, so he started sidelining them. He banished many people who were close to Khomeini, and they were quite senior as religious leaders. As they moved away, Khomeini brought in people who were religiously lower in ranks, and gradually a lot of members of the Revolutionary Guards, in other words, now people who are the backbone of the regime, are very much people who are part of the military rather than the mosque or our senior clerics. So the regime has become very much a military regime rather than a religious one. And Khomeini has rewarded them very generously by allowing them to be involved in the oil industry, developing a lot of economic projects, major economic projects. They've become very powerful. They are one of the most important forces in the country that oppose a deal with the West, because they have benefited hugely from the sanctions, from being in charge of the nuclear program, and they are one of the most powerful groups in the country that they have power, and they can oppose any kind of rapprochement with the West.
And this next question wants to talk about Iran's border with Afghanistan and what's been the effects on villages, towns, and city along that border as Afghanistan has gone through its struggles with the Taliban.
Well, Iran shares a very long border with Afghanistan, and eventually the regime built a very deep ditch because it was hard to control the border for many different reasons. First of all, refugees. The number of refugees that were coming into Iran at different stages over the years was huge. Iran has been quite a gracious host to a huge population of Afghans. And while it's grappling with its own economic problems, unemployment, the population of Afghans has been a burden. But more so, the problem has been drug trafficking. I think the major part of narcotics that is smuggled out of Afghanistan comes through this border and through Iran. And a big amount of it gets consumed inside the country.
And we're getting close to the end of our time, but I don't know if I got a good response from you in terms of what do you think the United States' position should be in relationship with negotiating with Iran on a nuclear agreement?
Well, we have to be very realistic. I mean, there are hardliners here who also oppose a deal. And Israel has done everything to prevent a deal. So President Obama has his own opponents here in this country. And I think both groups, hardliners in Iran and hardliners here, are trying their best to undermine the negotiations. The longer the negotiations take, of course, they have a better chance to undermine them, because the longer it takes, they can use that time to sabotage the situation. I'm just hoping that a political agreement, which was on the agenda last November, for both sides to reach a political agreement first, and then a comprehensive agreement, and now the deadline is March. I just hope that they can reach and meet that deadline, and then if they reach that deadline, we can be optimistic that a comprehensive deal can also follow.
Great. And I think we're at the point where we have time just for one final question, and it's come up several times. I think we all want you to look into your crystal ball. And for your home country, tell us what you see as the future of Iran 10 years out, 20 years out, maybe 50. Pick some decades and tell us what you think, Nazila.
Well, I think the fact that almost all the presidential candidates during the 2013 election were talking about reform, human rights, civil society, terms that were not part of our vocabulary in the 1990s and definitely not in the 80s, is a huge progress. Whether they believe in it or not, or whether they want to deliver it, I don't know. But the fact that they know this is what appeals to the majority of people, I think is very important. The other important thing is that during the 2009 uprising, many of the people who were, a lot of kids who were arrested were children of Iranian leaders, including children of Revolutionary Guards commanders who were present on the ground, beating up people, jailing them. So if these people have failed to raise their own children according to the ideology that they desired for the entire nation, that means that they have failed. They have completely failed. And there's no doubt that once these people are gone, and a lot of them are in their 70s now, there are not a lot of people who support those notions. I think change will come in Iran. The son of Iran's Speaker of Parliament was jailed. Several members of Parliament, their children were jailed. Children of Revolutionary Guards commanders were arrested. And the son of one Revolutionary Guard commander was brutally murdered in prison. And it appeared that the regime was sending a message to its own supporters, was saying that if you can't control your children, this is what's going to happen to them. Wow. So I think that's what the regime fears. It knows that change will come no matter what, and they are just holding on to the last strings that they can hold on to.
10 years, 20 years, 50?
I'm not. I don't have a crystal ball.
Okay. Well, that concludes our program for this evening. And on behalf of the World Affairs Council, I ask you to join me in thanking Nazila Fathi for this excellent discussion. And many thanks to you as well for your terrific questions.